It was a chilly Tuesday morning in Manhattan when Sarah Matthews hurried into the city's busy traffic court. The large, intimidating building stood tall against the gray October sky, its stone steps worn from years of worried footsteps. Sarah was running late, as usual, but this time it wasn't because of her hectic rehearsal schedule. The subway had been delayed, making her anxiety even worse. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy and stale. The wooden benches were packed with people from all walks of life. Businessmen in expensive suits, construction workers in their work clothes, and everyday citizens like Sarah. She found a spot in the back row, smoothing down her simple blue jeans and adjusting her comfortable black sweater. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, still styled from the morning's dance rehearsal. The room buzzed with whispered conversations and the shuffle of papers. Sarah watched as a court officer moved back and forth, organizing files and calling out names. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across everyone's faces, making the already tense atmosphere feel even more uncomfortable. Every few minutes, the large wooden doors would creak open, letting in another nervous person or a hurried lawyer. Judge Harold Bennett sat high above everyone else, his black robe making him look like a stern crow perched on his bench. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his wire-rimmed glasses sat low on his nose as he looked down at the stack of cases before him. He hadn't smiled once since the session began at 9 a.m. Now, 3 hours later, his expression had only grown more severe. Sarah noticed how he handled each case. Quick, efficient, and cold. Some people tried to explain their situations, but the judge seemed more interested in moving through his calendar than listening to their stories. He barely looked at anyone's face, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him or his computer screen. When case number 247 was called, Sarah's heart jumped. She stood up, her legs feeling shaky. As she walked down the aisle between the benches, she could feel everyone's eyes on her. The sound of her sneakers on the old wooden floor seemed too loud in the quiet room. She had dressed casually today, coming straight from rehearsal where she had been practicing for tomorrow night's show. There hadn't been time to change into anything more formal. Case number 247, parking violation on West 44th Street, the court officer announced, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Judge Bennett didn't even look up. He continued reading the citation in front of him, his free hand tapping impatiently on his desk. "Ms. Matthews," he said, still not making eye contact, "you were parked in a restricted zone for over 2 hours. The sign clearly states no parking between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. Sarah stepped closer to the podium. "Yes, Your Honor, but I can explain. The fine is $500. Judge Bennett interrupted, finally glancing up but looking past her rather than at her. His tone made it clear he had no interest in her explanation. Sarah felt her face grow hot. She had parked there because she was running late for an important meeting with the show's producers. It was a crucial meeting about extending the show's run, something that would affect not just her but the entire cast and crew. She opened her mouth to try explaining again, but the judge had already looked away, reaching for the next case file. The court officer to her right shifted slightly, giving her an odd look. Sarah noticed his expression change from bored to surprised as he studied her face more carefully. She saw the moment recognition dawned in his eyes, the same look she often got from people who had seen the show or her picture in the theater district. The fine was steep, much higher than usual for a simple parking violation. Sarah stood there for a moment longer, feeling the unfairness of it all. She was used to being judged on her talent, her hard work, her dedication to her craft. But here, in this courtroom, none of that mattered. She was just another face in the crowd, another case number to be processed and dismissed. Little did Judge Bennett know that the woman he had barely acknowledged, the one he had just fined without a second thought, had brought audiences to their feet just the night before. The same hands that now clutched her citation had gracefully moved across the stage of one of Broadway's most prestigious theaters. The voice he had so quickly silenced regularly filled a theater with songs that moved people to tears. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held the citation paper. The courtroom suddenly felt colder than before, and the morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed harsh and unforgiving. Judge Bennett had already moved on to the next case, but Sarah remained rooted to her spot, trying to process what had just happened. She thought about the events that had led to this moment. That afternoon, 2 weeks ago, had been particularly chaotic. The theater had called an emergency meeting about changes to the show's second act. As the lead actress, Sarah's presence was crucial. She had circled the block 5 times looking for legal parking, watching the minutes tick by on her car's dashboard clock. Finally, desperate and already 10 minutes late, she had parked in the restricted zone, promising herself she would move the car before the 2-hour limit. The meeting had run longer than expected. The creative team had gotten into a heated discussion about changing one of the show's most important scenes. Sarah's character had a pivotal moment in that scene, and she had fought passionately to keep its emotional core intact. By the time they finished, her car had been sitting in the restricted zone for 2 hours and 17 minutes. The ticket was already tucked under her windshield wiper when she returned. Now, in the courtroom, Judge Bennett's voice droned on in the background as he handled other cases. Sarah noticed how differently he treated some people who came before him. A well-dressed businessman who had run a red light got off with a warning. A young white college student with 3 parking tickets had her fines reduced. Yet Sarah's single violation had earned her one of the highest fines she'd heard all morning. The court officer standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. He had been watching the proceedings with increasing unease, his eyes moving between Sarah and the judge. Sarah could tell he wanted to say something, but court protocol kept him silent. The officer, whose name tag read Williams, had clearly recognized her, but remained bound by the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. Other people in the courtroom were starting to notice something was off. An elderly woman in the front row whispered to her companion, pointing discreetly at Sarah. A young man in the middle row was squinting at her, then checking something on his phone, his eyes widening with recognition. Sarah thought about her morning routine before coming to court. She had been up since 5 a.m. for early rehearsals, practicing the show's most demanding dance numbers. Her muscles still ached from the intense workout. She had chosen comfortable clothes over formal wear, not expecting to be judged so harshly for her appearance. Her simple jeans, sweater, and sneakers seemed to have influenced Judge Bennett's perception of her more than the actual facts of her case. The $500 fine wasn't about the money. Sarah's Broadway success meant she could afford it. What bothered her was the principle, the casual dismissal, the way Judge Bennett hadn't even bothered to hear her explanation. She had watched him listen patiently to others' excuses and stories, but her attempt to speak had been cut off almost immediately. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Just 12 hours ago, she had stood on stage at the prestigious Imperial Theater, receiving a standing ovation from a packed house. Critics had called her performance mesmerizing and groundbreaking. Yet here, in this courthouse, she was invisible, just another face in a long line of cases to be processed and dismissed. Judge Bennett continued working through his docket, unaware that the woman he had just fined was the same performer his wife had been raving about last week. Sarah had overheard him mentioning to the court clerk earlier about seeing that amazing new Broadway show with his wife. He had no idea that the lead actress he had praised was standing right in his courtroom, receiving such different treatment. As Sarah finally turned to leave, clutching the citation in her hand, she felt a mix of emotions: frustration, disappointment, and a growing determination. The same strength that had helped her overcome countless obstacles in her theater career was now pushing her to stand up against this injustice. She paused at the courtroom door, looking back at Judge Bennett one last time. The court officer, Williams, caught her eye and gave her a subtle, encouraging nod. Something told her this story wasn't over yet. Officer Williams couldn't stay quiet any longer. As Sarah turned to leave the courtroom, the weight of what he had just witnessed became too heavy to bear. He had spent the last few minutes watching the star who had moved his daughter to tears just last weekend being treated like she didn't matter. His daughter had waited at the stage door for an hour after the show just to get Sarah's autograph. And now here was that same kind woman being dismissed without a second thought. "Your Honor," Williams called out, his voice cutting through the courtroom's quiet murmur. His sudden outburst caused Judge Bennett to look up sharply, clearly annoyed at the interruption of his proceedings. The other court officers turned to stare at their colleague, surprised by this break in protocol. "Officer Williams, is there a problem?" Judge Bennett asked, his tone carrying a clear warning about disrupting his courtroom. His glasses sat low on his nose as he peered over them at the court officer who had never before interrupted a session in his 15 years of service. Williams straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor, there is." He glanced at Sarah, who had stopped at the door, her hand frozen on the handle. "Do you know who this is?" He gestured toward Sarah, who turned back to face the bench. This is Sarah Matthews, Your Honor. She's the lead in Dreams of Tomorrow at the Imperial Theater. The courtroom, which had been filled with the usual whispers and shuffling of papers, fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop as every eye turned to look at Sarah. The elderly woman in the front row gasped audibly, finally realizing why the young woman had looked so familiar. Judge Bennett's face went through a series of expressions, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally recognition. His eyes widened as he made the connection. Just last month, his wife had dragged him to see the show, insisting he needed some culture in his life. He had gone reluctantly, but had left the theater deeply moved by the performance, particularly by the lead actress who had brought the audience to tears with her powerful voice and emotional depth. "Miss Matthews," he said, his voice notably softer than before, Are you really the lead in Dreams of Tomorrow?" The stern judge suddenly looked unsure of himself, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing awareness of his mistake. Sarah stood tall, her quiet dignity filling the room. "Yes, Your Honor. I was trying to explain earlier. I was rushing to an emergency production meeting that day. We were making critical decisions about the show's future that would affect the jobs of over 50 cast and crew members." The young man in the middle row who had been checking his phone earlier suddenly stood up. "It is her. Look." He held up his phone, showing those around him the theater's webpage with Sarah's headshot prominently displayed. She just won a Tony Award last month. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. People began pulling out their phones, searching for information about the Broadway star standing before them. Some were already taking pictures, despite the no photography signs posted on the walls. Judge Bennett's face had turned a deep shade of red. He remembered now he had actually stood and applauded at the end of her performance. His wife had bought the cast album and played it constantly in their car. She had talked for days about the lead actress's incredible performance, about how she brought such humanity and grace to the role. "Miss Matthews," he began again, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment. I had no idea. I saw your performance last month. You were extraordinary." He paused, looking down at the citation he had just issued, the harsh fine he had imposed without a second thought. Officer Williams stood proudly at his post, knowing he had done the right thing by speaking up. He watched as the other people in the courtroom began to recognize the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. How quickly assumptions and biases could cloud judgment, even in a place where justice was supposed to be blind. Sarah remained composed, though a small, knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth. She didn't need to say anything. The situation spoke volumes on its own. The same judge who had dismissed her minutes ago was now stumbling over his words, trying to reconcile the simple woman in jeans and a sweater with the Broadway star who had moved him to tears. Judge Harold Bennett felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The comfortable certainty he had carried for 20 years on the bench was crumbling. He looked down at his hands, noticing they were trembling slightly as he remembered that night at the theater just 3 weeks ago. He had been sitting in the third row, his wife Margaret beside him, watching Dreams of Tomorrow. The same woman he had just found stood center stage, her voice filling the theater with such emotion that he had found himself wiping away tears. During intermission, Margaret had squeezed his hand and whispered, "Isn't she amazing, Harold? Such grace, such presence." Now, in his courtroom, that same grace was evident in how Sarah Matthews handled this uncomfortable situation. She hadn't shouted or made a scene. She had simply stood there, dignified, letting the truth speak for itself. "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Judge Bennett announced suddenly, his voice rougher than usual. The words seemed to catch in his throat. He needed time to think, to process what had just happened. As he stood up, he noticed his legs felt unsteady. In his chambers, he paced back and forth across the worn carpet. The walls were lined with law books and certificates, 20 years of legal experience captured in frames and bindings. But right now, none of that learning seemed to matter. He walked to the small window that overlooked the busy street below, watching people hurry past the courthouse. His mind kept replaying the last 30 minutes, how quickly he had dismissed her explanation, how he hadn't even looked at her properly. The fine he had imposed was higher than his usual for similar violations. Why? The question burned in his mind. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Williams, the court officer who had spoken up. "Your Honor, are you all right?" Judge Bennett turned from the window. "Come in, Williams." He gestured to a chair. "Tell me, how long did you know? About who she was?" Williams stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back. "I recognized her as soon as she walked in, Your Honor. My daughter and I saw the show last weekend. She waited an hour after the show to meet Ms. Matthews. That woman stayed and signed every autograph, talked to every fan. She was kind to everyone, especially my little girl." The judge sank into his leather chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "And I didn't even look at her, Williams. I didn't even give her a chance to explain." He pulled off his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "What does that say about me? About how I'm doing my job?" Through his open chamber door, he could hear the buzz of conversation in the courtroom. Word was spreading quickly about what had happened. He could imagine the social media posts already being shared, the headlines that would follow. "Judge humbled by Broadway star." But it wasn't the potential embarrassment that bothered him most. It was the realization that Sarah Matthews probably wasn't the first person he had treated this way. How many others had he dismissed without truly seeing them? How many stories had he refused to hear? He thought about his own daughter, who was about Sarah's age. What if someone had treated her that way? The thought made him feel sick to his stomach. Looking at his reflection in the window, Judge Bennett barely recognized himself. The stern, confident man who had sat on the bench for 2 decades seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who had just received a powerful lesson in humility and the danger of assumptions. "Williams," he said finally, turning back to the officer who still stood waiting. "When court resumes, I want Ms. Matthews brought back in. Is she still here?" He paused, straightening his robe. "And Williams, thank you for speaking up, for doing what I should have done, seeing the person, not just the case number." As he prepared to return to the courtroom, Judge Bennett knew this moment would change how he handled every case that came before him in the future. The leather-bound law books on his shelves had taught him about justice, but Sarah Matthews had taught him about humanity. By evening, the story had spread like wildfire across New York City. Someone in the courtroom had recorded a short video of the revelation, despite the no photography signs, and posted it online. The clip showed the exact moment when Officer Williams spoke up, capturing Judge Bennett's changing expression as he realized who Sarah Matthews was. Local news stations picked up the story quickly. The headline, "Broadway Star Faces Courtroom Bias," flashed across screens in Times Square, the same place where Sarah's face usually shone on theater billboards. People waiting in line at the Imperial Theater for that evening's performance of Dreams of Tomorrow were all talking about what had happened. Sarah sat in her dressing room, looking at her phone as message after message poured in. Her castmates had gathered around her, offering support and sharing their own similar stories. The show's director, an older black woman named Patricia, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You know," Patricia said softly, "this happens every day to people who don't have your platform. People who can't make headlines." She had been directing Broadway shows for 20 years and had seen this story play out countless times, just without the dramatic revelation at the end. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, hoping to catch Judge Bennett as he left for the day. The judge had spent the afternoon in his chambers, watching as social media exploded with comments and reactions. His secretary had already received dozens of calls from newspapers and TV stations wanting his response to the incident. One popular news website posted a side-by-side image, Sarah in her Broadway costume, taking a bow to a standing ovation, next to a sketch of her standing in the courtroom in jeans and a sweater. The caption read, "Same person, different treatment. What changed?" The post was shared thousands of times within hours. Local community leaders began speaking up. Reverend James Jackson from the First Baptist Church of Harlem appeared on the evening news. "This isn't about one judge or one actress," he said. "This is about the everyday experience of people of color in our justice system. The only difference is, most people don't have a Tony Award to make others see their humanity." Back at the courthouse, Officer Williams faced mixed reactions from his colleagues. Some praised him for speaking up, while others felt he had broken courtroom protocol. He sat in the break room, reading messages of support from his daughter and wife. "Dad, you did the right thing," his daughter had texted, adding a heart emoji. Judge Bennett's wife, Margaret, called him 3 times that afternoon. When he finally answered, her voice was filled with disbelief. "Harold, I can't believe it. We were just watching her perform last month. Remember how moved you were? How could you not see it was her?" The judge had no good answer. He sat in his chambers, reviewing his cases from the past week. How many others had he judged unfairly? How many times had he made assumptions based on appearance? The questions kept coming, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Social media platforms were filled with similar stories. People shared their own experiences of being judged by their appearance, their clothes, or the color of their skin. A Twitter hashtag just like Sarah started trending, with thousands sharing moments when they were treated differently until their achievements were revealed. Theater community members rallied around Sarah. Other Broadway stars began sharing their own stories of discrimination. A famous director posted about being mistaken for a stagehand in his own theater. A celebrated choreographer wrote about being followed in high-end stores despite her success. As night fell over New York City, the story continued to grow. News vans remained parked outside both the courthouse and the Imperial Theater. Inside the theater, Sarah prepared for that evening's performance, her hands slightly shaking as she applied her stage makeup. The show would go on, just like it always did. But tonight was different. Tonight, her performance would carry an extra weight. Every person in that audience would know about what had happened in that courtroom. Her story had become more than just another case of bias. It had become a mirror showing society an uncomfortable truth about itself. The morning after the courtroom incident, the Imperial Theater was surrounded by a sea of supporters. People held signs reading "Justice should be colorblind," and "We stand with Sarah." The crowd included Broadway performers, local activists, and regular New Yorkers who felt touched by Sarah's story. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, a young lawyer who had experienced similar treatment in courtrooms despite her credentials. "Every time I walk into court wearing anything casual, security assumes I'm a defendant, not an attorney," she told a reporter from the New York Daily News. "Sarah's story is my story. It's all our stories." Inside the theater, during the morning rehearsal, Sarah's fellow cast members surprised her with a special gesture. They all wore simple jeans and sweaters, just like she had worn to court. Thomas Chen, who played her leading man in the show, spoke for the group. "If they judge one of us, they judge all of us. We're showing that talent and worth don't come with a dress code." Social media continued to explode with support. Famous actors and musicians began sharing their own experiences with prejudice. A well-known rapper posted about being pulled over in his expensive car 6 times in 1 month. An Oscar-winning actress shared how she was once mistaken for a cleaning lady on her own movie set. The Broadway Actors Guild called an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. The large meeting room was packed with performers, directors, and theater staff. Many shared similar stories they had kept quiet for years, afraid of damaging their careers. The Guild decided to start a new program called See the Person, aimed at fighting bias in the entertainment industry and beyond. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests. Major talk shows wanted her to share her story, but she chose to speak first with a small local news station, sitting down with reporter David Kim, who had covered Broadway for 15 years. "It's not about me," Sarah explained during the interview, her voice calm and determined. "I'm lucky. I have a platform. People know my name now. But what about the thousands of others who face this every day? The mothers rushing to pick up their kids, the students running late for class, the workers hurrying to their jobs. Who speaks up for them?" The interview struck a chord with viewers. Within hours, people began sharing their own stories on a new website called Voices Like Sarah. A group of tech volunteers had created it overnight, giving people a place to share their experiences with prejudice and discrimination. At the courthouse, other judges started discussions about bias in their courtrooms. Judge Bennett's experience had made them uncomfortable, forcing them to look at their own behavior. A senior judge named Maria Gonzalez organized a special training session about unconscious bias, making it mandatory for all courthouse staff. Outside the justice system, the story continued to grow. Schools began using Sarah's experience as a teaching moment. A high school drama teacher in Brooklyn had her students perform a short play about the incident, showing how quick judgments can affect people's lives. Local businesses joined the conversation too. A coffee shop near the courthouse put up a sign saying, "Everyone deserves to be seen." They started a program where customers could pay forward coffee for others, encouraging people to look past appearances and show kindness to strangers. That evening, as Sarah prepared for another performance, she found a letter slipped under her dressing room door. It was from a young black girl who had seen the news. "Dear Ms. Matthews, It read in careful handwriting, "Thank you for standing up. I want to be on Broadway too, and you showed me that I shouldn't let anyone judge me before they know who I am." The letter brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She pinned it to her mirror, right next to her Tony Award nomination letter. Both pieces of paper told stories of achievement, but now the simple note from the young girl felt just as important as the prestigious award. Throughout the city, conversations were happening in homes, offices, and classrooms. People were talking about their own biases, sharing stories they had never told before. Sarah's experience had opened a door, and through it poured thousands of voices that had been waiting to be heard. Judge Bennett sat in his home office late one evening, staring at the carefully written letter in front of him. He had rewritten it 7 times, trying to find the right words. This wasn't just any letter. It was a public apology to Sarah Matthews, and he wanted every word to be perfect. His wife Margaret stood in the doorway, watching him with concern. "Harold," she said gently, "maybe it's better to say this in person." She had never seen her husband so troubled in their 30 years of marriage. The confident judge who always knew exactly what to say now struggled to find the right words. After a long moment, Judge Bennett nodded. He picked up his phone and, with slightly shaking hands, asked his secretary to arrange a meeting with Sarah Matthews. To his surprise, Sarah agreed to meet him the very next day at a small coffee shop near the theater. The coffee shop was quiet when Judge Bennett arrived, wearing a simple suit instead of his judicial robes. He felt strangely vulnerable without them. Sarah was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked up as he approached, her face showing neither anger nor judgment. "Miss Matthews," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "thank you for meeting me." He sat down, noticing how the other customers were trying not to stare. Word had spread about the meeting, and a few photographers waited outside. Sarah smiled slightly. "Would you believe I almost got a parking ticket coming here today?" she said, breaking the tension. Judge Bennett couldn't help but laugh, and suddenly the air between them felt lighter. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, looking directly at her for the first time. "About that day in court, about all the days before it, about how many times I might have done the same thing to others." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was wrong, not just about your case, but about my whole approach to justice." Sarah listened quietly as he continued. Judge Bennett told her about his plans to start a new training program at the courthouse. He had already spoken to the chief judge about requiring all court staff to undergo regular bias training, but he wanted to do more. "I'd like to start a community dialogue program," he explained, his voice growing stronger with enthusiasm. "Regular meetings between judges and community members. Not in the courtroom, but in neighborhoods, churches, community centers. Places where people feel comfortable sharing their stories." To his surprise, Sarah leaned forward, interested. "That could make a real difference," she said. "But it needs to be more than just talking. There needs to be real change." Judge Bennett nodded earnestly. "I've already started. This week, I've changed how I handle every case. I make sure to look each person in the eye, to really listen to their story. I've adjusted fines based on people's ability to pay. It's not perfect yet, but it's a start." He told her about a young man who had appeared in his court the day before, charged with a minor offense. Instead of just imposing a fine, he had taken the time to understand the man's situation. It turned out the man was working 2 jobs to support his sick mother. Judge Bennett had connected him with social services instead of adding to his financial burden. Sarah smiled, a real smile this time. "That's the kind of change we need," she said. "Not just in the justice system, but everywhere. People need to feel seen and heard." They talked for over an hour, their coffee growing cold. They discussed plans for a new program that would bring theater arts to disadvantaged youth, combining Sarah's artistic background with Judge Bennett's connections in the legal community. As their meeting ended, Judge Bennett had one more surprise. He handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was an official court document dismissing her parking ticket and refunding her fine. But more importantly, there was a personal note apologizing for his behavior and thanking her for teaching him such a valuable lesson. "This isn't just about a parking ticket anymore, is it?" Sarah said, looking at the papers. Judge Bennett shook his head. "No, Ms. Matthews. It's about making sure that justice really is blind. Blind to privilege, blind to status, blind to everything except the truth of each person's story." As they stood to leave, Several people in the coffee shop broke into spontaneous applause. Someone had recorded part of their conversation, and within hours, this new chapter of the story would spread across social media, showing that real change was possible when people were willing to learn and grow. 1 year after the courtroom incident, Sarah Matthews stood on a different stage. This time, she wasn't performing in a Broadway show, but speaking to a packed auditorium at the New York City Judicial Conference. The audience was filled with judges, lawyers, and court officers from across the state. Change doesn't happen in one dramatic moment, Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. It happens in thousands of small moments, in daily choices to see people for who they really are. Judge Bennett sat in the front row, nodding in agreement. He had become one of her strongest allies in pushing for judicial reform. The See the Person program, which they had created together, was now being used in courthouses across 5 states. The program paired judges with community members for regular meetings and discussions. More importantly, it required judges to spend time in different neighborhoods, understanding the daily lives of the people they served. Officer Williams, who had first spoken up in the courtroom, had been promoted to lead courthouse diversity training. His daughter, now a theater student herself, often helped with role-playing exercises that taught court staff about unconscious bias. The exercises used real situations, including Sarah's story, to show how quick judgments could affect people's lives. At the Imperial Theater, things had changed too. Sarah's show had added a new scene about justice and judgment, inspired by her courthouse experience. Every night, audiences watched as her character faced prejudice and overcame it through dignity and strength. The scene always received standing ovations. But the biggest changes were happening in everyday moments. Like when a young black lawyer walked into court wearing casual clothes, and the judge asked about her case instead of assuming she was a defendant. Or when a Spanish-speaking mother was given time to explain her situation through an interpreter, rather than being rushed through the system. Sarah's inbox still received daily messages from people sharing their stories. A teenage boy wrote about how his school principal had stopped assuming he was a troublemaker just because of his appearance. A woman told how her local bank manager had apologized for previously treating her differently when she wore her work uniform. Judge Bennett had kept his promise to change. His courtroom now had signs in multiple languages welcoming people to share their full stories. He had adjusted his court schedule to allow more time for each case, ensuring everyone felt heard. Other judges had started following his example, creating what they called dignity-first courtrooms. The Broadway community had embraced the movement too. Theaters started offering special performances for community groups, bringing in people who had never seen a show before. Sarah often stayed after these performances, talking with audience members about their dreams and challenges. One evening, as Sarah prepared for her show, she found a familiar face waiting at her dressing room door. It was the young girl who had written her that first letter a year ago. Now she was part of a youth theater program that Sarah and Judge Bennett had started, bringing arts education to underserved communities. "Ms. Matthews," the girl said excitedly, "I got the lead in my school play." She was wearing a See the Person t-shirt, part of a line that raised money for legal aid services. Sarah hugged her, remembering her own journey from that difficult day in court to this moment of joy. Later that night, after her performance, Sarah sat in her dressing room looking at a new photo on her wall. It showed her and Judge Bennett at the opening of the first community justice center they had created together. In the picture, they were surrounded by young people from their theater program, all wearing judicial robes and holding scripts. The caption under the photo read, "Justice sees all." It was a simple message, but it had changed countless lives, including her own. Sarah touched the photo gently, thinking about all the stories yet to be heard, all the changes yet to come. Outside her window, the lights of Broadway shone brightly, but now they shone on a city that was slowly learning to look past appearances, to see people for who they really were. The story that began with a parking ticket had become something much bigger, a reminder that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity.